Good morning and welcome. Welcome, bienvenidos to those of you. Again, welcome to the Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs Fair Housing Month program. The theme for this year's event is Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing and what that means for Fairfax County and You. My name is Barksdale Hagans, and I have the esteemed pleasure of acting as your host and moderator for this morning's Fair Housing program. We are extremely excited to have you join us for this information sharing and celebratory experience. First, before we get started, I want to give a shout out to two organizations that have been critical in collaborating with our office to make this event happen today. They have just been a tremendous partner with us, and I want to recognize the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors and the Equity Rights Center. A lot of what you see outside and helping us get this started is part and parcel due to their collaborations with our office today. So please, let's give them a hand. Thank you so much. Here in Fairfax County, we are celebrating the county's golden anniversary. That's 50 years of standing up and embracing the principles of fair housing. 50 years of making sure that residents and individuals alike are able to enjoy equal housing choice. It was 50 years ago in 1974 that Fairfax County codified its fair housing ordinance, making it illegal to engage in any form of housing discrimination here in the county. The Honorable Providence District Supervisor, Ms. Dahlia Palchik, is with us this morning to make a special announcement. I'd like to welcome her up front, as well as our director, Mr. Michael Sims, if you'll come down. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good. Well, I don't normally like acronyms, but I think OREP is a good one. And I used to think April was just pollen month. But I'm so excited to be doing this. And before I read the proclamation and present it to Mr. Sims, you know, I want to say 50 years, right? And this is a golden moment. It's a great celebration. We also know, and people who've been doing this work for 50 years, that there is so much more that needs to be done. Whether we are investing in housing, and our housing director, Tom Fleetwood, is here. Thank you, Tom, and every day working to braid the lasagna of funding for housing, for increased housing. We know there's not enough housing and not enough housing being built. And that's why the board has given our goal of 10,000 new units and just almost 1,000 that we've committed to and actually have broken ground in the Tysons area. But we know whether it means equal housing, access to housing. For me, one of my dearest friends in high school, she had a mom from Norway and a dad from Liberia, and her mom told me just how hard it was. She had to go alone to look for housing when they were out in Iowa before they moved here because they just got turned away as a biracial couple. And so we know that we've addressed some of those issues. We've just updated our zoning ordinance for the first time in almost 50 years. And it took us 3 years and 2 lawsuits to make sure that that remains codified. And I think we've got to do a 3rd round soon. So it is tough work. We know Michael's up for it, and we know that we can't do it alone. So thank you to our partners, both in the nonprofit and the private sector, because this really is a work of all of us. And I'm not a lawyer, but I know these are really, really tough cases. to stand up to. And so I know that our resources from the OREP's office to our general counsel to our housing offices are very much invested and continue to invest in this work, and that we are committed as a board to ensuring hopefully even more success in the next 50 years. So I know if Congressman Connolly were here, he'd yell at me for reading this, but I'm going to read it regardless to his representative here. Whereas April 11th marks the 56th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which enshrined into federal law the goal of eliminating racial segregation and ending housing discrimination in the United States. And whereas housing choice and equal access to housing are transformative, ensuring equal access to quality education opportunities, safe neighborhoods, and a better future. And whereas 2024 marks the 50th anniversary of the Fairfax County Human Rights Ordinance, which provides equal housing opportunities for all residents of Fairfax County, regardless of race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, familial status, military status, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, marital status, or source of funds. And whereas our social fabric, the economy, health, and environment are strengthened in diverse, inclusive communities. And whereas April is celebrated throughout the nation as Fair Housing Month to recognize and extol the value and virtue of equal housing opportunities and fair treatment. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, on behalf of all Fairfax County residents, does hereby proclaim the month of April 2024 as Fair Housing Month in Fairfax County and urges all residents to support and advocate for equal housing opportunities for everyone. And that is signed by our chairman, Jeff McKay, and by Rodney Lusk, supervisor from Franconia District, and myself as a very much honored chair of the Housing Committee. Thank you. Who's got the photo? There's Devin. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very excited for your event and our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you again, Supervisor Palchak. And again, let's give them another round of applause. That's fantastic. Now, bear in mind, here in Fairfax County, we have made great strides, as the supervisor has said, and seen some significant changes as a result of the codification and the adoption of the county's Fairfax Fair Housing Ordinance. We have evolved and grown with the changes in society to be a leader here in the Commonwealth and the country, making Fairfax County a welcoming space for diversity and inclusion. The Fairfax County Housing Ordinance actually mirrors and reflects the Federal Fair Housing Act. As the supervisor just mentioned, that aspect of the ordinance itself reflects the 7 protected classes that are stipulated in the Federal Fair Housing Act, which is race, color, religion, national origin, sex being gender, familial status, and disability. Now, bear in mind, most recently, though, a couple of years ago, the county expanded the language in the protections in the ordinance to include elderliness, meaning people 55 years of age and older, sexual orientation, gender identity, military status, marital status, and source of funds. So we're trying to cover a whole panoply of different issues that are affecting our community. Here in Fairfax County, we strive to create a welcoming community where every county neighbor and friend will feel safe to live, strive, and raise their families free from cruel, insidious, and unwarranted acts of discrimination. So again, we are pleased, and I want to thank you all for taking time out of your schedules this morning to join us. So with that being said, let's get this party started. We have a rare opportunity this morning to be in the presence of a civil rights icon and glean from and learn from one of the best in the world in the space of fair housing. It is my honor and esteemed pleasure to present for your listening and learning experience, Ms. Sara Pratt. Ms. Pratt is an attorney at the prominent civil rights law firm of Relman Colfax PLLC, where her practice primarily centers on civil rights litigation and issues, focusing on issues related to the Fair Housing Act, Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, and other civil rights laws. But that's not it. Listen closely. Prior to joining Relman Colfax, Ms. Pratt was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing Enforcement and Programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. There, she also served as the Senior Advisor to the HUD Assistant Secretary. Now, I could go on and on for the next 2 hours to share all the achievements and things that she's accomplished and done, but to suffice it to say, she is definitely an expert, and believe me, she's the real deal. So please help me welcome Ms. Sara Pratt.
Thank you. Can you tell that I hate being introduced? It's not my favorite, I have to tell you. I'm very happy to be here today in Fairfax County. My history with Fairfax Human Rights Commission goes back 20 years or more. I did trainings for commissioners about how to put on a hearing, how to decide a fair housing case years ago. And I trained staff here too when we were first started talking about the idea that certain policies and practices that were not intentionally discriminatory nonetheless had the effect of discriminating against people of color and women and other groups protected by the law. I think I had the pleasure of reviewing Fairfax County's ordinance when it was first submitted to HUD for approval as being substantially equivalent to the Fair Housing Act, because by then I had made it over to HUD. But I feel like the people in this audience and the people at the Human Rights Commission are here for a reason. That you're not just here because it's Fair Housing Month, right? You're here because you have a commitment, you have a concern, you have an interest, you have an issue that needs to be talked about, it needs to be thought about. And what I've been asked to talk about is the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. Now, I would bore you to tears if I talked about how long we have struggled to frame that issue and to get something concretely accomplished to show us how to affirmatively further fair housing. I have to start in 1968 because that obligation was part of the original Fair Housing Act. The initial Fair Housing Act passed by Congress 7 days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, with Lyndon Johnson signing it in the White House as riots swept the streets of America. This obligation about affirmatively furthering fair housing is not a enforcement like the thou shalt not deny or withhold housing because of race, color, religion, thou shalt not make, print, or publish a discriminatory statement. It's not a thou shalt not in that way. So it's not enforced on a day-to-day basis as part of an enforcement process. It is bigger than that. The concept is that the programs and the activities across the country that have to do with housing and urban development, those programs must engage in actions that affirmatively move fair housing forward, specifically to undo past discrimination and to take further steps into the future. Now, that's been on the law since, did I say it, 1968? And are we still there? My PowerPoint needs to be up. Oh, there it is. Very good. And so it's been on the law since 1968, but there's been a variety of efforts, some of which I lived through at HUD, to try to get it implemented and to figure out the framework for implementing it. The definition that you've seen on the screen up there is what the current regulation at HUD says generally about the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. It's a good concept. So it originated in a regulation that I had the privilege to work on when I was at HUD. It was taken down by a later administration. I do not put a name to that person. And it was put back in the recent administration. So look at the language here. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is actually taking meaningful actions. Notice it is taking actions. It is not sit around talking about it. It is taking meaningful actions. Meaningful action, not just actions of some random type, but meaningful actions. But this next phrase is important. In addition to combating discrimination. So Fairfax County combats discrimination through the Human Rights Commission and perhaps through actions of individuals and their faith-based organizations, their social organizations, their neighborhood-based activities, and in other ways, there's efforts going on to combat discrimination. Raise your hand if you think we've stopped discrimination in Fairfax County. Just checking, okay? In my world, which includes everywhere in the country. I've been in Pittsburgh and Grand Rapids in the last couple of weeks, and I'll be in a few other places before the end of Fair Housing Month. No one tells me that discrimination is done. We have not finished fighting discrimination, okay? And yet, the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing says we have to combat it. So that means that all of us in this room have that obligation, right? In where we are. Whether it's the government, whether it's the supervisor's job, whether it's the Human Rights Commission, whether you're in an organization, a social organization, or the NAACP, or the Equal Rights Center, whether you're just living in a neighborhood, right? We've all got that obligation. And the meaningful actions, in summary, are to overcome patterns of segregation, because the Fair Housing Act, where this provision is found, added its threshold concept to provide an integrated and balanced communities across the country. 1968, that was the promise, okay? And to foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity. So those are great words. Opportunity, can you tell me what opportunity is? Who can tell me what opportunity is? Okay, they told me you had to come down here at the mic to ask your questions anyway or to make your comments, so I'll give you some answers. Opportunity is a great location in Fairfax County, a job or other activities where you don't have to commute to DC, right? Or you've got to commute in some other kind of way. Neighborhoods that are inclusive and safe and have access to commercial and retail, the CVS, I'm not going to say the Starbucks because honestly, that's not commercial. Well, it is commercial, but there's a Starbucks everywhere. I wish we could put a CVS everywhere we put a Starbucks, or an urgent care center, right? Or a grocery store. I go to church in DC. We struggled within our neighborhood to get a grocery store within walking distance of the people who live there. People were having to take cabs to go to the grocery store where I lived, in the middle of Washington, DC, where I go to church, for years, right? And so opportunity neighborhoods have good schools, right? They have access to jobs, access to transportation, public or otherwise. They have affordable housing choices as well as high-end housing, right? What else is a sign of a high opportunity neighborhood? People get along, people talk to each other.
Quality education.
Quality education is really a very big one, so that people want to live there and stay there and get their kids through school there. Yes, absolutely. So the thing about affirmatively furthering fair housing is this conceptual idea of taking actions to undo old patterns of discrimination and segregation. Now, how many of you think that there are areas that are segregated in Fairfax County? Yeah, a lot of you do. Segregated by race, perhaps. Segregated by national origin, where people have come in from other countries and they've settled in the same neighborhoods because maybe that's the affordable housing that they can find, or for other reasons because they get steered out of or discriminated against in other neighborhoods. So you have areas of segregation. You also have areas where people are segregated by language and cultural barriers, which may be barriers that prevent them from fully participating in education, in public policy, in benefits that are available to other folks in the community, to even how do you get in touch with your county government or your local businesses. So the principle behind the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing is to identify those barriers and develop strategies to reduce them or eliminate them. It's a planning concept. For those of you who listen to right-wing news, anyone in this room? Not so sure. But you know, they talk about this. I've heard them talk about this. People would call me. They'd listen to a TV station. They'd call me when I was at HUD and said, this AFFH thing, it's going to destroy my neighborhood. And I'm like, it is. Really? Because that's not what we've intended to make happen here. What the AFFH rule does is gives a structure or a template for local governments to make plans to address old stuff that's still unfixed about discrimination and lack of access, disparities in transportation and education or whatever, identify them, and make a plan that they then implement. That's the meaningful actions part, to make change. It's a plan. So my first husband was a planner, had a master's degree in planning, and there's some planner out there that said, make no small plans, right? But the question about affirmatively furthering fair housing is, well, what should your plan include? And what should it address? So as the slide says, the whole idea about affirmatively furthering fair housing is that it applies to all kinds of a program participants / Fairfax County's activities relating to housing and urban development, all of those activities, whether or not they're federally funded. So this obligation is not tied to federal funding. So if you get some, here in Fairfax County, if you make a commitment, let's see, if you make a commitment to provide 10,000 units of housing in Fairfax County, I just heard a reference to that. Some of that may be federally funded, some of it may not be. Some of it may be tax credit development. Some of it may be, I don't know what the funding sources are. In some communities, it's lottery money, right? But it doesn't have to be federal money to be covered by the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. But the challenge is, how do you structure this? So, I mean, really, you could run from fire to fire in Fairfax County. You could say, oh my God, there's this thing over here with education. Oh no, there's this other thing about here, we have a hate crime. Oh, there's another thing over here that needs some other kind of attention. And so the whole idea behind working on this obligation is to develop a template, a strategy, a way of thinking about this that's not just generally make a plan and implement it. It's more specific than that, to make change in local communities and to require that the local communities participate in the process, but to not mandate any particular outcome. Why is that? Because every community is different. I talked about this very same thing at the COG up around Baltimore a few months ago. Same idea. They've got whole different problems up there. There's a black neighborhood that's likely to be destroyed by construction of a new tunnel. There's a whole set of issues about displacement there that is a real struggle and is going to have to take a lot of attention by the local community to keep it from being rammed through, displacing a lot of people of color who will have nowhere to go in Baltimore City. Right? And that kind of displacement, parentheses, if you've ever heard or known someone who's been displaced like that, where they had a community, a family, a church within walking distance, or a synagogue within walking distance, and they knew everybody, and they all played together when they were kids and grew up together. I go to church with folks like that in DC. And to have that disrupted, to have a big chunk of that community ripped out of the community and taken away, and placed perhaps in all kinds of different places, what it does to the community structure is really sad and can be avoided with some care and some thought. So I'll just give you one example since I'm gone off on down that particular little rabbit hole and say, for example, suppose you're having something, new construction, highway construction, or something that's that's going to destroy an older kind of ramshackle kind of neighborhood, and perhaps it's occupied by Latinos, say. So how do you avoid displacing them? Well, you don't avoid displacing them. What you do, however, offer is the opportunity for them to choose where they might be relocated to and how and when, and to make available the places to which they will be relocated, a range of places perhaps, and offer them the opportunity to move before their homes are destroyed. It's called Build First. And it means build the replacement housing first, or identify the replacement housing first. So there may be some groups in that group that want to go to the affordable housing out near the nice high school, so their kids can go to a good high school and not be around that neighborhood right at the moment. There would be another group perhaps that are working in DC and would prefer something that has an easy commute via metro, so they would be interested in transit-oriented housing. There might be someone else and a housing choice that may need to be offered in a home ownership setting, where people could be gotten ready to have home ownership and move to an opportunity that's funded through the county to have an opportunity for home ownership, either directly by the county or through some opportunity like Habitat for Humanity. Okay, can you see how the choices expand in that way? Well, the AFFH obligation is really about that. It's offering more choices and trying to undo barriers and segregation and poverty in ways that may have been ignored over time, and to rebuild and reimagine so that you end up eventually with a community across the county that is diverse, that has housing choices, that have opportunities to have access to education, they have infrastructure in their communities, they have services in their communities, right? And that the old school stuff goes away gradually. Am I explaining the general concept to it? Yes? Okay. So this is really good. There was this proposed rule published last January, a year ago January, by this HUD, saying, affirmatively further fair housing proposed rule. And I wrote comments for it, for 2 clients. One of them I can tell you, I think, don't tell them I told you so. The AARP submitted comments on this. AARP represented older people, and they had some thoughts about what older people specifically would be interested in this particular agenda. A lot of it centered around affordable housing choices for seniors, and housing choices that were close to grocery stores, drugstores, public transportation, those kinds of things. Because seniors as a group tend to be more impoverished than the rest of the population, speaking generally. And while they want to be near their families, some of them no longer have families, but they still need to be able to get to the grocery store, connect to services, and get on a bus if they need to, right? And so this rule, the comments were made I don't know, they were filed probably by April of a year ago. And we heard that the next step in rulemaking in the federal government is proposed rule, comments. There were about 500 comments. This is not nearly the high number of comments I've seen when I was at HUD. I worked on a rule that had 18,000 comments. 500 comments is manageable. It doesn't take that long. Okay, and most of them actually were mostly positive with concrete suggestions for improvement, which were the comments that I worked on. Yes, we're so happy you're doing this, but we have some additional ideas we want you to consider. Okay, you go through a process, we review this. We've been hearing for months that the final rule was going to be coming out. And then we heard a concrete announcement that it was going to come out for Fair Housing Month, which we are in right now. Sadly, we heard just before the beginning of Fair Housing Month that the rule still needed some work. Do you know there's an election this fall? I'm not saying there's a causation here, I'm just stating a fact. And then the other part of the rumor was the rule's not going to come out until January. So I've worked for the government for a long time. And, you know, it's hard not to say, well, there's got to be some kind of connection. I don't know of anything that would hold up this rule. So as a result, let's see, the final rule appears to be on hold. Nearly 300 fair housing, faith-based, environmental groups, housing groups, wrote a letter to the White House last week saying, where's the rule? They're saying Timing is important. Actually, if this rule came out today, it would be effective in 30 days. And you know what it would apply to? It would apply to those jurisdictions like Fairfax County, lots of community development block grant recipients, state and local communities, population over 50,000. A lot of them are on a calendar year of July 1 to June 30th. So if the rule went into effect in May, it would apply to those jurisdictions with a calendar year that started July 1st. And so you would have a phase-in process. And you would have this phase-in process no matter what, but there are a number of such jurisdictions that have processes that start July 1 to June 30th. And so the timing was actually important. But the other bottom line about any final rule, and I'm not privy to what HUD is saying in its final rule because it's secret. They haven't announced it. They haven't told anybody what it's actually going to do. But in any case, there's a phase-in time. And there has to be a phase-in time. You know why? Because in the process of doing this, they have to have public input. And I'm going to leave you with a charge when I leave here today to tell you that you need to be involved in the public input into this AFFH implementation process as it will exist in Fairfax County and perhaps in the bigger COG in which Fairfax County is a participant and who is doing with which Fairfax County is doing its fair housing planning, along not just with Fairfax County by itself, but with a group of other recipients in the geographic area. And of course, Fairfax County, DC, some parts of Maryland, some parts of Virginia, some parts of, and then DC, all have a set of common interests and common concerns, even though each little area has its own unique things. And so the idea is share on the things that are where we can share and make it and take positive steps like transportation, maybe transit-oriented housing in some communities. And then on other areas, we will have our own things for Fairfax County because we're different than Montgomery County, Maryland. Okay, we doing okay so far? All right. So the final rule is on hold. It is unknown when it will be published. If I were a betting woman, and I am, January. And that's too bad because it's the kind of thing where you kind of are ready for it. I was interviewed by a reporter about this, and I said, people are anxiously awaiting, this guidance. It's been a long time. I worked on the rule that was published in 2016, and at HUD, I worked on the rule and I worked on the template for Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. I talked to a lot of people, did a lot of presentations. Communities want to get into this, but they don't know where to start. And the process doesn't give them a place to start necessarily. So what I'm going to do is talk about the promise of the proposed rule. And I'm going to tell you what you can do, some of, right now. So the proposed rule purpose is to, they said when they published it, remedy the legacy of public and private policies and practices that have created segregated communities. That phrase alone, there's a long list of stuff to think about. It's appraisal bias, which we've heard a lot about publicly, and which my law firm just settled a case with a national lender, who I cannot yet name, who, when approached by a person who wanted to have a loan from them, so they had applied from the loan, the company had sent out an appraiser, the appraiser did a lowball appraisal under the value of the sales contract. The couple alleged race discrimination. We represented the couple in a lawsuit against both the appraiser and the company, and we've settled the case against the company now. It has not yet been announced. But this is a key issue for people who cannot get good appraisals on their very excellent houses because they're in Black neighborhoods or Latino neighborhoods. And honestly, I've seen a number of these cases, and the appraisals that I've seen, which I'll give you is a small percentage of all of the appraisals in the world, so I'm sure not all of them are like this. But if you're an appraiser and you only consider comparables that are right in the same neighborhood, in a Black neighborhood or in a Latino neighborhood, it's potentially going to undervalue a house that's in great shape and ready to be marketed And because of historic patterns of segregation and undervaluation of the houses in the neighborhoods. And so if you can get comps even a mile away, and you're looking at houses in whiter neighborhoods that have the same style house, the same age of house, the same construction, and look at those comps, they will end up elevating the appraisal, right? And so you can get a more real value of what the real value of the house is, not the value decreased by patterns of discrimination and segregation. You with me? So there's that. There's the long-standing patterns of lending redlining across our country. I have represented clients in lending redlining cases, and I'm working on 2 more right now. And I can tell you that the old maps from 1937 that show patterns of redlining in a community still are relevant when you look at lending practices of lenders today. Because when you plot the loans the lenders are making and the borrowers and the houses that they are serving, you often see underrepresentation of people of color, and you see housing loans not being made available in black neighborhoods or Latino neighborhoods by lenders, even though other lenders seem to be perfectly capable of getting loans in those communities. So when you have those kinds of disparities, it's an important indication of the patterns of things that lead to discrimination. Someone talked to me last week about taking on home ownership assessment, government, county assessment for property tax purposes, that in some cases houses in neighborhoods are undervalued because of the property tax assessment process, and they're wanting to look at it more to see if that is artificially depressing the value of the housing in those neighborhoods. There's some challenges to doing that. My answer generally is yes, we should look at that, but in general, we should give people of color and others in neighborhoods that have been depressed financially for a long time a break on property taxes for the foreseeable future, maybe a 5, 10, 20-year break on the increased property taxes that come when a community is moving upward, not to encourage gentrification, but to encourage primary residence, home ownership, somebody working on their house that they got from their grandma because they inherited it and they need to fix it up and they want to bring it up in the neighborhood. Should they be the person who gets penalized by higher property taxes the next round? You know, I think there's some subtleties here that a property tax assessment office can think about. You know, we have the homestead exception. You remember this? A lot of communities, if you're over a certain age, 65 or 60, you get a cut on property taxes, you get a reduction on it. I feel like we could have the same kind of approach for primary residences in communities of color. So that would avoid the gentrification thing, because a lot of the gentrification is is done by investors. So they're not using the houses as primary residence. These are just ideas to think about. Public transparency is critically important. I mean, critically important. And I think Fairfax County is one of the places where transparency is happening, and that's good. But I have to say that having public access and input in a meaningful way is really critical to an affirmatively furthering fair housing approach. And I like, rather than big hearings where everybody comes with their own bone to gnaw on, smaller focus groups where you could have an issue, and the issue might be affordable housing in the XYZ neighborhood. What would it look like, right? So if you've got a commitment for 10,000 affordable units, I hope they're all affordable, maybe mostly at least. But the question is, who are they affordable to? Now, I'm just going to tell you, everywhere I go, that if you would tell me that you are meeting the housing needs of people with a 30% of area median income or below, I would go, how did you do that? It's a miracle. Because in every community I go to, the poorest of the poor are the people who need affordable housing the most, and it is the least likely group to be served. People tell me all the time, well, it's truth, it's truth. You know, for home ownership, you're looking, if you can get home ownership at 80% of area median income in this high-priced community, that would be something. If you can get rental housing at 30% and 50% instead of this 80 or 90% that people keep talking about, and make it be a meaningful number in different locations as part of a plan that says not just we're going to make a lot of housing available, we're going to make X% of that housing affordable at 30% area median income, and here are the target neighborhoods for this. See, that's when you start making progress, because that's the devil's in the details. You take an elevated goal, which is important and critical to set the sights on, but then in an affirmatively furthering fair housing context, you make a more precise plan to say, and this is how we're going to address this. We're not going to put affordable housing as much in the same old neighborhoods where they're already affordable. We're going to put them in new areas. Tyson's Corner, I heard. Areas where there's public transportation and access to amenities and all of that stuff. Maybe near the metro, right? Or the MARC train, depending on where you are. And so you think about this as transparency, get the specifics going, look for flexibility, create accountability, set metrics. Yes, metrics. Create accountability, have a community group that's advising, maybe including some of you in here, and specifically identify local fair housing issues, and including partners with the Human Rights Commission, the fair housing groups that serve this community, and with neighborhood groups and civic organizations, everyone from the NAACP and the Urban League to the Latinos United to others, to have input from them early in the process to ensure community input that we know what the real issues are, not where the complaints are filed. And I'm going to tell you, I did complaint enforcement for many years. The complaints that get filed are people who actually have been hit over the head with discrimination, and they just can't, they have to file. But there are a lot of people who don't even recognize the systemic injustice that goes on in their communities all the time that has resulted in the disinvestment of communities of color and the lack of opportunity for people to have access to the kind of opportunities that other people take for granted. I used to give a speech in which I said, well, I was a single mom and I had a daughter, and the stuff I wanted from my home was exactly what every other single mom with a kid or two wanted. I don't care if you're white, black, green, orange, Latino, Asian, whoever it is. You know what it was? Walking distance, good access to the schools and a good school first, right? Walking distance to a drugstore or a place they could get a quart of milk, okay, because sometimes we need a quart of milk. Access to job opportunities for my teenage after school jobs, access to public transportation so she could get on the bus and I wouldn't have to come home from work early to take her to a soccer practice, right? How is that different from what someone who's living in public housing now and hopes to move up into a low-income tax credit property in a good school, that near jobs for after-school jobs for her high school age kids, away from the gangs in her current neighborhood, looking for a place that you can get a quart of milk in the middle of the night if that's what you need, looking for a place where people can get on a bus and get to where they need to go. These are just ways of thinking about how people live and how you can meet those needs sort of considering new environments. So the process, let's see, how are we doing? There's a process in the current rule that, not surprisingly, starts with engage with community. And part of my comments to HUD was bring in community engagement even before you do the first draft. So we have professional planners. I was married to one. He was a planner from the city of Louisville, Kentucky when he died. But he would always sit there and write these plans. I'm like, who are you talking to as you write this? Who are you talking to? So we'd go out and talk to people because, you get in one headset if you're a professional planner and you work for the county and this is what you're doing and you've got all those pressures. But the neighborhood folks have opinions too, and I really believe that community engagement tells us a lot. It may sometimes need translated or framed, and sometimes it can be gotten by having smaller group discussions on particular issues instead of everybody coming in and saying, well, this is just what I want happening. You conduct an analysis and you look at various elements. You prioritize your fair housing issues. You set goals. I mean, this is a standard planning process. This is what my husband learned when he got his master's in planning. You make progress reports annually with metrics, if you can, to show that you're actually moving towards the activities, and you incorporate your goals or strategies into other plans like regional transportation plans and those kinds of things. Maybe there's a healthcare development plan, maybe there's an education plan, maybe one of your first meetings, by the way, is with the Board of Education. If good quality education, someone said it up there, and I thank you for saying that, talking to the Board of Education about improving the schools that are in communities of color and poor neighborhoods, while looking at areas where there already are good schools and thinking about affordable housing choices near those schools. That's the kind of balancing act that the AFFH obligation makes you think about. So you end up producing, under this proposed rule, an equity plan. And the equity plan has 7 different kinds of issues. So one is demographics. So who knows the demographics of Fairfax County? What percentage white population of Fairfax County? 50%-ish? ACS data suggests 50%. Asian? 20%. Black? 10%-ish. Hispanic? 7%. Maybe a little bit higher there at this point. And other 10, 12, 15%, right? 2 races, other races and ethnicities. So you look at the demographics first because they tell you something about the community and what the representation is, but then you look neighborhood by neighborhood. When I was in Pittsburgh talking about AFFH, I said, what about neighborhood plans? You have geographies, you have neighborhood plans. Get together the neighborhoods and think about a neighborhood plan for each one. Because one neighborhood needs the grocery store and the CVS and a metro stop and better schools. And another neighborhood needs affordable housing because it's high end and it's costly to put affordable housing there, and yet it's got the great school, right? So you look at that and you have neighborhood plans that you identify what the needs are, looking from the lens, not just at the parochial needs of the high opportunity neighborhood or the particular needs of a poor neighborhood, but looking at it through a fair housing lens. How would you elevate the area that's poor and segregated and without much of the way of resources, and at the same time, how would you incorporate opportunities for them elsewhere? That's how the lens works. So a frame for this is segregation and, versus integration, and HUD put together fabulous maps. You can look at them today online, AFFHT. I type it in my sleep. I look at that data all the time. I looked at Fairfax County's data this morning. Don't tell anybody that I was driving at the time. We also identify racially diverse and areas that are also poor. So that doesn't mean we don't consider or can be concerned about neighborhoods that are white and poor, because of course we are. But at the same time, because of the fair housing focus, we look first at the RCAPs or ECAPs, which are racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. Why is that? Because they're most likely to need investment of whatever kind, whether it's better infrastructure, sidewalks, sewer lines. In Fairfax County, maybe those aren't the actual issues, but maybe they are. In a lot of places, the black community still has paved roads, still pays for the garbage pickup as opposed to having it provided as a public service, has no street lights, has no public sidewalks. I grew up, I did civil rights in Kentucky. My first case was a lawsuit against a county in Kentucky that had paved the roads to the white neighborhoods and the white churches and had dirt roads to the black neighborhoods and the black churches. That was my first case. You want to talk about racial disparity, it just looked at you right in the face because you had eyes to see. So that's one of the things about this. You have to have the eyes to see the issues. You looked at who has access to community assets. You look at, and this is important, who has access to affordable housing opportunities and where are the gaps. There's data sets that the county has that says, what the cost burden populations are like. Is it families with children? Is it people with disabilities? Is it seniors? Okay, thank you. You look at that data because then you develop your plans for housing and support services based on who's cost burdened and who does not have the services that they need to support them. You look at access to home ownership, and I think that's likely to be a big issue in Fairfax County. This is a single family kind of commuting community, and yet it's also high income, and home ownership opportunities for poor people and people of color and people with disabilities are going to be a problem. And so thinking about creating There's a HUD program called Home that allows home ownership creation, so you don't just stick with Habitat for Humanity. You can use Section 8 vouchers for home ownership. If you've got a family that's a good size and you have a high voucher, you can use a voucher with a lender to support home ownership. So there's a lot of opportunities here if you're intentional, if you're looking for answers, and if you're really focusing on what the barriers are that people have. The proposed rule says let's develop goals, and these are like, the goals are like what they call SMART goals. They have to be designed to address the actual problem. They have to result in positive change. They have to be consistent with a balanced approach, which is to say you invest in communities of color and you provide housing choices in other areas outside of those poor neighborhoods. So balanced approach means you look at everything. You don't ignore anything, but you prioritize concrete actions that are meaningful that you can take to remove barriers that come from historic discrimination. I've been given the high sign, and of course I'm not done yet. Barksdale, I told you. All right, I'm going to do a few more minutes, and then I'm going to stick around through the intermission. If somebody wants to come and talk to me individually, please feel free. So the balanced approach is make sure that you're providing resources everywhere. You're not picking on only this neighborhood and throwing all your investment here and not making opportunities elsewhere. And it means invest in communities of color, put affordable housing in other neighborhoods because maybe there's already a good deal of affordable housing there, but invest in different ways, economic development. We look for communities and for assets that can provide mixed income and mixed-use housing. So mixed income means market rate and some affordable. Tax credits are a good tool for doing that. Transit-oriented housing in many places has been workable as long as the transit station wasn't originally put in a poor segregated neighborhood, in which case more housing may not be needed there. You may need economic investment instead. Consideration of what you've got. What are the strengths? Every neighborhood has strong points. Every neighborhood has good stuff going on there. Almost every single one. Look for those good points and think about how you can enhance those and bring them up, elevate those neighborhoods. I'm going to skip time frames and just say there's a few gaps in the rule about affirmatively furthering fair housing, and the first one is, and I worked at HUD, but it's really noticeable how there's no obligation of HUD to do anything. It's all the people who HUD's given the money to, but HUD programs, some of them, could prioritize the kind of spending that you would love them to prioritize to use in Fairfax County. So that was my biggest comment, because HUD itself, as a federal agency, has its own obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And I can tell you that it could use some additional emphasis on that. There is a difference between fair housing and affordable housing. And, Westchester County, New York got into terrible trouble and lost their funding from HUD because they only focused on affordable housing, and they didn't focus on fair housing and undoing longstanding patterns of segregation in Westchester County and zoning rules that limited where you could develop affordable housing. So all the small communities in Westchester County allowed 2 units, maximum 2 units of housing. There's no way you can do affordable housing at that scale, right? You can't. It's the garage unit. It's the unit over their garage in the backyard that they were talking about. And so if you're going to do affordable housing, you have to have scope. You have to have scale. You have to have 60 units in order for financially for it to make sense. And so because zoning didn't allow that kind of development, and Westchester County went down swinging on this. I mean, I'm telling you, 3 years they lost their funding because they would not even evaluate their zoning to see if there were changes that could be made. So again, this is planning. You have to do the plan first. That's not even that hard. They could have done the plan, I'm telling you. And they then have to take meaningful actions, right? But they didn't want to do that. All right. What I think about the affirmatively furthering obligation is this. We have I'll skip a slide or two and say we have a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals right here in this room. This is a group of people who could change the world in Fairfax County using the AFFH process. Yeah. I've seen it happen in other communities where groups like you have gone and thoughtfully evaluated what the community needs are, gone to public hearings or to individual council members, say, we need this, we need that, we need more housing for substance abusers who are out of the opioid addiction process and trying to beat it and need community-based housing for them. We need more affordable housing for people at 30% area median income, and we should focus that on seniors. But it should also be in great neighborhoods where they can walk and catch a bus and go to the grocery store themselves. We need this. So not just being generically happy, let's pay attention to fair housing, very specific with recommendations, thinking about who the populations are that need to have the barriers removed, and how the most integrated way would be to do that. I'm charging you with the responsibility to be there, to be the thoughtful group, small but mighty, of committed people who will lead the change to affirmatively further fair housing in Fairfax County. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Let's give Ms. Pratt another round of applause, please. You know, she not only did she make sense, but she has shared a lot of important information that we each can sort of grab hold of, take back home with us, because we all have a role to play. She has peeled back various layers of how the rule could actually be implemented and make a critical and important change here in our community. And we all have a role to play. You know what we have to do in our office at OREP. You know, we're hired to do a job, and we'll do our job. But you, each one of you sitting out here in this audience, you have a role that you can play as well. And there are things that you can do, even if it's just simply taking part and providing the input once that process starts. So start thinking about how you want to see change take place in your community, in your neighborhoods, and the things that you can do to participate in that process. So again, thank you one and all. So let's move along here right quick, because we have some more very good information that I think that you will be able to appreciate to see how this all works and comes together. Next up, we have some special guests from George Mason University's Center for Social Science Research. And they will be providing information that was gathered in their analysis of impediments, which basically they did and conducted to identify benchmarking data and results and how the information may align with the fair housing plans that are required for the new AFFH rule, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule. So please welcome Dr. Amy Best, the professor of sociology and a doctoral student, Mr. Drew Bonner.
Yes. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting us to report on our benchmark findings and to be a part of this really meaningful and important conversation. A quick note about our work at the Center for Social Science Research before I hand things over to Drew. So we conduct community-engaged research focused on long-term community partnering. We're committed to social science research as a civic tool or a resource to thicken democracy, to reduce inequities, to promote human flourishing. We focus on system-level change and capacity building through research. And as we do research, we begin with the understanding that expertise and solutions already reside within communities. So we are asset-based, we are strengths-based, and we are anti-deficit in our work. So we were tasked, let me just move that over. So we were tasked by the county to learn about other jurisdictions' efforts to reduce fair housing barriers and promote fair housing choice. I'm going to turn it over to Drew. Take it away.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Morning. So for our benchmark methodology, we set out to conduct interviews with 8 benchmark jurisdictions. In the fall, we met with stakeholders from Fairfax County, as well as community organizations involved in fair housing work, to identify those jurisdictions. County stakeholders were especially interested in localities that prioritize equity, as well as those that recognize the importance of distinguishing fair and affordable housing, as we heard previously. These stakeholders were helpful in helping us develop focus areas for our work, as well as interview questions. So we collaboratively identified a list of 28 jurisdictions and began outreach and recruitment for interviews through emails and phone calls. We were met with a lot of availability, capacity, and timing hurdles. However, we appreciated a reluctance to talk frankly about fair housing compliance best practices. Among the jurisdictions that did grant us an interview, in all cases, we were referred to their fair housing councils. And so to date, we have interviewed 3 fair housing councils, and our outreach efforts will continue through May. On this slide here, you can see the 15 jurisdictions that we looked at. A secondary source of benchmarking data is from our systemic review of analysis of impediments. On the screen here, you can see the 15 analysis of impediments reports that we identified based upon our original list of jurisdictions. We also identified a total of 62 analysis of impediments reports from the HUD website in total. For folks not familiar with the analysis of impediments, these are jurisdictional reports required by HUD to provide details on barriers to fair housing and interventions to promote fair housing choice. As a quick note, from our stakeholder meetings, we were encouraged to look at jurisdictions that were actively integrating HUD guidelines, given HUD's leadership in driving meaningful improvements in fair housing. So we identified 4 key elements of jurisdictions' efforts to reduce barriers to fair housing and promote fair housing choice. First is promoting regional cross-sector collaboration, building robust community participation, integrating systems-level thinking, and correcting for past discrimination in housing using a racial equity lens. For regional cross-sector collaboration, you want to build and support collaborative cross-sector and community-based partnerships across regional jurisdictions and with community-based organizations as well as other nonprofit organizations. Robust community participation requires target outreach that affirmatively welcomes community involvement among historically excluded groups. Host regular community engagement events and programming planning that is designed to address disparate impacts in specific neighborhood and community-based needs and impediments. Other forms of community-based collaboration could include community-based councils or advisory boards, as well as community-involved data collection for needs assessment practices. To integrate systems-level thinking, you want to incorporate systems-level approaches to understand and address factors that limit equitable access to housing for your region and for all protected classes within your region. Systems-level fair housing approaches may consider improvements to public transportation, as we heard previously, increased affordable housing supply, address historic and current geographical segregation and exclusion, as well as prevent housing displacement for all protected classes. In correcting for past discrimination in housing using that racial equity lens, you want to assess and address the history of racial segregation and past trends in barriers to fair housing, evaluating their impacts and disparate housing needs. Focus actions to reverse historical patterns of discrimination and exclusion in order to promote inclusive neighborhoods and communities and fair housing choice. Align your understanding of local history with HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing, addressing current and past segregation and redlining, housing displacement, and community and capital disinvestment. So we see these core pillars of fair housing being operationalized within 5 key areas of fair housing planning. That includes governance and organizational structure, monitoring and data integration of trends and impediments, complaints and assessment processes, fair housing interventions and programs, and dissemination and reporting. So on governance structure and organizational structure, we learned that regional cross-sector collaboration between governmental offices, community-based organizations, and other nonprofits, such as fair housing councils, fair housing authorities, public housing agencies, fair housing action centers, fair housing consulting groups, and activist groups, as well as tenants' rights organizations, all help to facilitate stronger community participation and outreach, as well as greater community accountability in operations, monitoring, assessment, and reporting. For example, we found that New Orleans utilizes the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, which provides educational offerings, free legal services for victims of housing discrimination, policy advocacy, and foreclosure prevention counseling. So on monitoring and data integration, you want to establish measurable fair housing goals and priorities. Use data and analytical tools to better understand the barriers to fair housing across the jurisdiction and to guide actions to promote fair housing choice. Focus on disaggregation of data for targeted programming. Identify indicators to measure and track barriers to fair housing choice, and develop performance measures to evaluate program impacts. When tracking trends and impediments, align with federal fair housing planning guides for each protected class under HUD, as we've been advised earlier. Assess the unique demographics of your locality and community demographic change over time. One example is within our interviews with Minnesota, they extended their definition of protected classes based upon local ethnicity population trends, such as an increased East African and Southeast Asian population. They made provisions to extend the linguistic inclusivity of their housing information by implementing a limited English proficiency plan to increase participation in their first home down payment assistance program. When tracking housing trends, incorporate plans to address the potentially diminished housing stock, address the cost burden to residents presented by continued housing inflation, assess the accessibility and availability of affordable, subsidized, and public housing, assess trends in housing type and availability, so that might include rental properties versus homeownership rates, and the location of housing based upon historical and persistent racial segregation. This will highlight the potential opportunity source mismatch in the housing market. Other notable trends for consideration include land use and zoning practices, income discrimination, financial institution lending practices, such as redlining, as well as individual credit history reports, and many other considerations as well. We also identified a few mayoral statements that highlight the importance of tracking demographic and population trends. Mayor Stephen Noble of Kingston, New York, acknowledged that equitable development should take into account how housing interacts with factors like transportation, walkability, and employment, as we heard earlier. Statements like these highlight a greater recognition of systems-level impediments to fair housing, like opportunity source mismatch, insufficient transportation, and socioeconomic disparities. When analyzing impediments to fair housing further, review and address the history of your practices, such as zoning and land use, discriminatory financial lending practices, and broader racial segregation that might impact your unique demographic in your locality. In addition to documenting past practices, look towards new practices and trends. For instance, there may be issues in algorithmic biases or technology-based biases that covertly embed discrimination within housing acquisition processes. So for example, housing listings, housing appraisals, advertising, and marketing may promote racial discrimination. A review of history will provide a more comprehensive understanding of discriminatory housing practices, from issues such as realtors that engage in racial steering, to more systems-level oriented considerations like transportation, to persistent racial segregation and displacements abroad. One example from our interviews was the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, who has been engaging in documenting the history of segregation, white flight, and redlining in their city, utilizing RGS mapping to map patterns of racial settlement and displacement. You can go up on their website and actually look at the maps from the 1930s and the 40s that overlay with present housing maps, and it shows the patterns of racial discrimination. To further assess impediments, conduct a community-based needs assessment that amplifies community members' voices, empowers community members civically, as well as bringing community members to the table to build on their expertise. So, on complaints and assessment practices, streamline grievance procedures and complaints processes for your residents. For front-end ease, complaints should be filed on user-friendly systems with easy navigation. For back-end responsiveness, grievance procedures and complaints should be handled expeditiously and transparently. Across our analysis of impediments and our interviews, all jurisdictions emphasize the importance of streamlining the front-end and back-end processes for complaint submissions. One specific example was from Minnesota, which they highlighted that it's very confusing in their locality, for not only for the residents, but also for the staff on where the complaint should go. There's no state representative for fair housing in the state of Minnesota, so it's really up to the residents to figure out on their own who to work with a legal aid, figure out on their own who to work with or work with a legal aid to figure out where their complaint should go. And then after such, the rental protections which contribute to fair housing are enforced either at the state or the city level. So this highlighted the organizational and systemic importance of streamlined complaints processes. On assessment practices, adherence to HUD testing requirements is critical. In conjunction, engaging in community assessment practices such as surveys, interviews, focus groups, and other sources of data collection to gather information on the lived experiences of your community members may also benefit you in your fair housing planning. For example, from our interviews, we learned that the Baltimore Metropolitan Council does a large community needs assessment survey in conjunction with all other counties in the Baltimore metropolitan region. The surveys gather insights into the demographic trends of the communities, challenge faced related to housing acquisition, as well as potential experiences of discrimination. Baltimore utilized the survey data to create regional fair housing action steps unique to their region, and then track the success of the fair housing plan implementation based upon this survey data. Another critical strategy is to engage in assessment practices related to the housing market, including audit testing and reviews of housing application processes, financial lending practices, and housing safety and maintenance. Another notable example from our interviews was the Fair Housing Council of Northern New Jersey, in which they conduct audit testing on the housing market, which then is reported to HUD. These audit tests are conducted utilizing a matched pairs design to compare the way housing agents or lending companies treat equally qualified home seekers in different racial or ethnic groups or broader demographic categories. These tests serve as accountability measures to understand how fair housing may promote racial segregation, income discrimination, and other impediments to affirmatively further fair housing. So when thinking about some jurisdictions that engage in novel community interventions and programs that were data-driven and community-informed, we wanted to highlight two. The first is Chicago. Chicago developed 3 programs. First is the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which is a foreclosure prevention program. They also created the Chicago Community Land Trust, as well as the Chicago Low Income Housing Trust. These programs and interventions were generated from a community-engaged needs assessment, in which the data was collaboratively generated that helped them to identify untapped resources within their community, including land use resources, as well as foreclosure prevention resources. Another novel fair housing intervention is the collaboration between the Fair Housing Council of Northern New Jersey and Seton Hall University law students. The Seton Hall University law students facilitated all aspects of the fair housing complaints process for the residents in New Jersey. They facilitated the submission of the complaints, completing legal paperwork on their behalf, and any other follow-up processes. The program minimizes the burden of fair housing complaints filings on residents by utilizing a community resource, the law students, through an established network of institutional and community partners. So on dissemination and reporting, all benchmark jurisdictions engage in fair housing dissemination practices. These forms of communication served as tracking mechanisms for fair housing operations and planning, as well as opportunities for reciprocal exchange between fair housing practitioners and community residents. A best practice is to adhere to the HUD 5-year analysis of impediments plan and utilize the report template. For example, in the Baltimore case, they utilized the analysis of impediments template from HUD, which is called the Assessment of Fair Housing Template. While this template is no longer required as a reporting measure, they believe it's important to build upon their history of enhancing community engagement processes, as well as continuing to examine the regional impediments collaboratively with community members. More routine assessments are beneficial as well, which may be in the form of annual reports or analysis of adherence to your fair housing plan. Following Chicago, this may be in the form of quarterly reports posted on your website, or other forms of reporting that may include newsletters or fair housing brochures, such as those that are distributed by Bergen County, New Jersey. You may also engage in town halls with community residents to engage in that reciprocal exchange, as well as social media activity and social media posts, following the example of Boston's Fair Housing and Equity X account, formerly known as Twitter. And another great example that we found of routine reporting was the City of Orlando's website that hosts the Fair Housing Plan Update and Project Snapshot. So we provided that link here. So to conclude, we hope that you find within this presentation a lot of things that you are already doing, as well as some new strategies and practices that will assist in achieving your fair housing goals. So thank you for your time today. Resources.
Thank you, Dr. Best and Mr. Bonner. Very good. Now, as you can see how the AI, the analysis of impediments, it interconnects and in some ways sort of overlaps what's being promoted with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that we're looking forward to coming out. So all of these things are interconnected. So we're going to take a quick break here and give you the opportunity to stretch your legs. We're going to have a brief intermission for 10 minutes. I think the time now is 11:20. So if you could get back here by 11:30, we'd appreciate it, and we'll start up with the second half of our program. Thank you. I want to thank you all again for your participation in attending today's program. Now, personally, I want to share something. You know, I believe for our country and the nation as a whole to be more open-minded and appreciative of the importance of civil rights and human rights, it helps to start introducing these concepts and these principles to people early in life. We here at OREP, we take this to heart. We take it quite seriously. And we try to engage our young people here in the county, helping them to understand and to take part in making our community better. Now, to help me explain how we go about achieving this, please welcome Mr. Josh Verveka, who is the Senior Director of Government Affairs at the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors.
Well, good morning. On behalf of the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, thank you to everyone who's here for this outstanding program, for sticking around past the intermission, and for the next panel that we have. NVAR, we have more than 13,000 realtors across Northern Virginia and the DC region, and they are doing more than 15,000 transactions annually that represents $16 billion in sales. Our members are the voices and faces of real estate in Northern Virginia. They serve all walks of life, not only with the highest level of professional competency, but also with care and dedication to fulfilling the dream of homeownership for all. We at NVAR, we're committed to upholding and advancing the principles of fair housing, and through continued education on fair housing issues, breaking down biases, we strive to make proper housing for all a reality. We are proud to work with Fairfax County on all aspects of fair housing, including today's program. And as part of this, we're excited to sponsor the Fairfax County Student Human Rights Commission's Fair Housing Art Contest. For those who don't know, the Student Human Rights Commission is the region's first commission comprised entirely of high school students, and its primary function is to promote diversity and foster greater understanding of the differences among youth in the Fairfax County. So we're proud to announce this year's winners of the Student Fair Housing Art Contest. Unfortunately, our winners are not able to be with us here today. They have school. But we do have their artwork, and we have Bethany Pereira, the advisor to the Student Human Rights Commission, who will be here to accept the awards on their behalf. So in our second place winner, who will receive $200, is Isabel Fernandez from Chantilly High School. And the first place winner of $300 is Lure Elbador of Centerville High School. So thank you to all the students who participated in the SHRC and this art contest. For anyone who's interested, applications for the SHRC for the 2024-2025 school year will be available on OREP's website in May. Thank you.
Also, I understand that the program can be seen on the cable channel 16, Fairfax County's cable channel 16, and will it also be on demand? And it's also on demand also, so for anyone who would like to go back and see the program again, because, I mean, it really is a lot of information to try to digest. Excellent information, very good, but it's a lot to take in, particularly if you're not familiar with the concepts and the subject itself. So, again, those are available to you after you leave the program, and you want to take advantage of that again. So now, moving right along, we have a very good item to present now. We're going to pivot to our panel discussion. We have a phenomenal group of experts from local organizations and agencies that are with us today. These individuals have been leaders in their respective roles and capacities in the field of fair housing. Please allow me to introduce our panel of experts. Now, bear in mind, I'm not going to go through their backgrounds and bios. For the sake of time, I don't want to take up too much time with that, but if you have access to see the program document that you can either get from the QR code or the hard copies that we have all of that information regarding their backgrounds on that. So with that being said, first I'd like to introduce, hello, is this on? No, it's not. Let me try this again. Okay. Testing, hello. Great. First up, we have Ms. Gloria Crawford, the chairperson leading the Fairfax County Human Rights Commission. Seated next to her is Ms. Sabrina Ware, the Deputy Director for Advocacy with Legal Services of Northern Virginia. To her right, Ms. Larissa Zer, Senior Staff Attorney with Legal Aid Justice Center. Then next, Ms. Maria Flax, Senior Director of Legal Affairs for the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors. And last, but certainly not least, Ms. Susan McClanahan, Senior Manager of Fair Housing Rights Programs for the Equal Rights Center. Let's give them all a hand. So I really want to get started by giving each of you the opportunity to share information about the organizations or the entities that you work with and how you go about promoting or addressing issues of fair housing. So I'm going to start with Ms. McClanahan. Will you share some information about the organization that you represent?
Absolutely. Hey, how's everyone doing this morning? Okay, you guys, we can do this. How's everyone doing this morning? Woo! Yes, let's bring the energy. My name's Susie McClanahan. I'm the Senior Fair Housing Rights Program Manager at the Equal Rights Center. And we are a civil rights organization based in Washington, D.C. that seeks to identify and eliminate illegal and unfair housing discrimination. as well as discrimination in public accommodations and employment in our home community of the greater Washington, D.C. region, including Northern Virginia, as well as nationwide. Thanks so much for being here, everyone.
Now, as a follow-up to that, as it relates to fair housing, what related services does your organization, the Equal Rights Center, provide?
Sure. So we first off have an intake program where we provide direct assistance to individuals who are experiencing housing discrimination. We'll interact directly with housing providers to try to resolve their concerns so that, for instance, they can either get the housing that they were trying to apply for or remain in housing and address whatever the issue was. We assist folks with disabilities with requesting reasonable accommodations in housing. We also assist individuals with filing for housing complaints, such as Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity programs. And we also conduct systemic investigations in order to identify housing discrimination proactively and make sure that we can eliminate it before anyone encounters that experience. And also do public advocacy and work with housing providers so that we can improve our communities and further promote fair housing.
Great, thank you so much. Next, Ms. Flax, please share some information about the organization that you represent.
Thank you so much. I'm loud usually, but not that loud. Thank you so much. I'm Maria Flax. I'm the Senior Director of Legal Affairs at the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors. We are a realtor trade association, as Josh mentioned, comprised of 13,000 members. And our mission is that we're dedicated to elevating realtor success by driving exceptional value and innovation and impacting the industry. So our members, Josh mentioned, were comprised of real estate agents, brokers, property managers, attorneys such as title attorneys, as well as service providers in the industry. So home inspectors, appraisers, and various other providers.
Okay, that's good. Now, will you share with our audience some of the related services that NVRA provides?
Yes, definitely. NVAR is very dedicated to promoting fair housing. So one of the things that we specialize in is education. So we host programs. We run certification and designations for our agents on fair housing. Many of them are implemented by the National Association of Realtors. So for instance, At Home with Diversity is a certification. And there's a Fair Haven certification, as well as, just teaching Virginia, Maryland, DC law. A lot of which has to do with fair housing. One other important program that we administer is that we actually administer the Realtor Code of Ethics, under which Article 10 deals with fair housing. And so that's a really big one that we administer, as well as we also we run a legal hotline, so a lot of our agents phone in with questions about the Code of Ethics as well as the law in Virginia, and we help them out with that. And then we also provide a lot of evergreen content available for our members, such as FAQs. There's a lot that focus on fair housing and a whole section for that. We put out regularly videos, blogs, and podcasts on the subject, as well as hosting free events.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Now, bear in mind, she's on the housing side of things, so we're glad to have her as well as their organization here today. Ms. Zare, please share some information about the agency that you represent.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Larissa Zare with Legal Aid Justice Center. So we are a nonprofit organization that provides free legal assistance and also advocacy to low-income folks across Virginia. We have offices in Richmond, Petersburg, Charlottesville, and then here in Falls Church in Northern Virginia. And so our mission is to partner with communities and clients who are directly impacted by injustice to dismantle systems of racial, economic, and social oppression. So we do our work in partnership with community partners and our clients as well.
Yeah, we're always glad to have partners like Legal Aid Justice Center. Now, can you also share some of the related services that your organization provides?
Sure. So I'm a housing attorney in our office. We do provide direct legal representation to community members. And then we also, what our sort of primary way of working is to integrate community organizing with legal advocacy. So that can look like direct client representation. It also looks like providing community education and outreach in terms of know your rights information. And it also can look like local and statewide policy advocacy, as well as litigation if that's fits into our community partners' goals. And so in the way that looks in terms of fair housing is when we are either representing folks individually, or we are working with our community partners and we identify a potential fair housing issue, we'll incorporate that into our advocacy, and then we also partner with lots of these organizations up here as well as others in Virginia to identify fair housing issues and see if there's ways we can tackle them together.
Collaboration, that's great. Ms. Ware, please provide some information about the organization that you represent.
Thank you for having me. I'm Sabrina Ware, Deputy Director for Advocacy with Legal Services of Northern Virginia. We are a nonprofit legal aid program, and we serve the Northern Virginia region. We handle a variety of civil legal matters, including eviction and foreclosure prevention, family law and domestic violence. Additionally, we handle public benefits and healthcare access issues, as well as cases involving consumer law and also elder law.
Can you also share with us some of the fair housing related services that your organization provides?
Sure. I would say we encounter a lot of fair housing issues that are sort of intertwined with what other housing matters. So as I mentioned, we do a large number of eviction prevention cases. Our primary focus is on preventing evictions and preserving affordable housing. So many of our clients are in subsidized housing programs, and there may be an eviction case that comes in, and we may find through our investigation and working with the client that there are some underlying fair housing issues that are involved. Additionally, we do handle a decent number of reasonable accommodation requests for tenants who have disabilities and need some type of an accommodation in their housing.
Now, Legal Aid Services, they're an excellent organization because so many times we see complaints come in our office and they're more landlord-tenant related as opposed to being fair housing cases. There is a distinct difference between the two. And so in those instances where we receive complaints that are landlord-tenant related and have those types of issues, we can then refer them to Ms. Ware and her organization. So please bear in mind, because we see this so many times, and it's not the fault of the complaining party or the person who's experiencing these issues, but we try to help them understand and make that distinction so that we can then direct them to the proper agency. Thank you again. Last but not least, Ms. Crawford, and we certainly work tirelessly with her and her group. Will you please share with our audience information about the entity and body in which you lead?
Yes. Good morning, and thank you, Barksdale, for that introduction. I'm chairperson of the Fairfax County Human Rights Commission, which was established by the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. And it consists of 12 residents of Fairfax County appointed by the board, some of which are here today. The commission is responsible for ensuring compliance with the Fairfax County Human Rights Ordinance and the Fairfax County Fair Housing Act, which is provided in terms of the legal name, Chapter 11 of the Code of Fairfax County, which prohibit discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodation, private education, and credit on the basis of the protected classes that are set forth in the ordinance and the Fair Housing Act. With the support of the Human Rights and Equity, and I'll refer to OREP from now on, and as provided by law, the Commission receives and oversees the investigation of complaints, including testing-initiated complaints that allege a violation of the Fairfax County Ordinance and the Fair Housing Act.
Okay, very good, thank you. Now, can you share with our audience what related services that the Human Rights Commission provides?
Yes. Respecting fair housing, as previously stated, through the support of OREP, the Commission receives and oversees the investigation of housing complaints that allege a violation of the Fairfax County Fair Housing Act. In this regard, OREP receives and investigates complaints from any person alleging discrimination based on the protected classes provided by the Act. And those include race, color, religion, national origin, sex, gender, identity, sexual orientation, disability, elderliness, which is 55 plus in housing, familiar status, marital status, military status, source of funds, and retaliation for complaining of discrimination. The Commission also fosters cooperation with others in the community to promote fair housing.
Okay, thank you so much. So what I want to do now is present a couple of, or some questions for you each to consider and respond to. And you can do it in any order that you feel comfortable in doing so. I'm not going to single out any one person or group. So the first question I have is, what are some of the prevailing fair housing issues or problems that you see or hear about that are raised in the course of work that you do? Anyone?
All right, I'll weigh in on that. Thank you. So, I mentioned previously that we run a legal hotline for the real estate agents and brokers. So a lot of the questions that we get on a pretty frequent basis have to do with emotional support animals. Many of the agents and many of their landlords, if that's their clients, they don't understand that under fair housing law, service animals and emotional support animals are both covered and both considered assistance animals. And so they have to be treated the same. So that's a big one. We also get a lot of questions from the agents about the source of funds as a protected class when it comes to both rentals and sales of property. We get a lot of questions about running criminal background checks for tenants. And the other thing is a lot of advertising questions. Sometimes they want to know if you can advertise preference for a protected class. And so, of course, our guidance for these different topics varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but the important thing for the members is that they want to make sure that they're not denying equal professional services to anyone or assisting in discrimination. So it's very important that we run the hotline.
Anyone else?
And I would also like to add, again, in terms of what you mentioned, we get a lot of complaints in terms of disability and in terms of the reasonable accommodation. There are a lot of complaints in that regard. And again, in terms of the emotional support animal versus the service animal, there are a lot of conflicts with that. So those are some of just a few of the areas that we get a lot of complaints on involving.
Yeah, denials based on requests for accommodations, that's a hot issue, not only here in Fairfax County, but across the entire nation. So no, thank you for pointing that out. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Sure. I wanted to mention, in terms of kind of the intersection of different issues, with regard to an eviction case, while an eviction case in and of itself is not necessarily a fair housing case, we may identify fair housing issues. And I would say, anyone who goes into eviction court, even just as a public observer to see sort of what transpires, sometimes it's very evident, the contrast in the courtroom. Who's the tenant, who's the landlord, who has access to representation and attorneys and who doesn't. And so I would say that eviction, which is kind of sort of an invisible crisis sometimes in our society, it really ultimately is a fair housing issue. And there was a study that came out in the last year that a quarter of Black babies and toddlers in rental households will be faced with the threat of eviction in a typical year. So it really is a fair housing issue, and it's something that we should all be paying attention to. Another sort of intersection that we see quite a bit, because we do a lot of family law and protective orders, is we see housing issues that affect survivors and victims of domestic violence. And that is also a protected group that may be is a little bit less commonly known and understood, but if, for example, someone resides in housing and was the victim of a domestic violence incident and then is faced with eviction because of that, that is illegal, and so there are a lot of rights and protections for domestic violence victims and survivors, so I wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, we will send cases their way because they can also address and tie in any potential violations under the Violence Against Women's Act on that matter. So no, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think, so we sort of, Legal Aid Justice Center's work in Northern Virginia kind of comes at fair housing from a slightly different angle because we work primarily with immigrant communities in Northern Virginia. And so thinking about fair housing issues that we see often in immigrant communities, we see language access discrimination issues for limited English proficient folks. And we also see either legal status documentation requirements or different application requirements for folks who are citizens versus folks who are not citizens. And so those are some things that come up. And if those are things that you're aware of, we'd encourage you to reach out on that type of issue. We think those requirements often disproportionately deny access to housing then for people based on their race or national origin. And I also just want, in the spirit of what Sabrina was saying, I think it's pretty stark in Northern Virginia. I remember I think it was 2021, the Community Foundation of Northern Virginia came out with a study showing that low-income folks in Northern Virginia experience the highest rate of severe rental housing cost burden in the nation compared to other large metro areas. And so thinking of the inequality here, and then all of course, as we know, we're all here on Fair Housing Symposium, those numbers are disproportionately worse for Black, Latina, and then also for immigrant families in Northern Virginia. And so access to affordable housing is a fair housing issue here because of how the housing cost burden breaks down. So we are really interested in the conversation around affirmatively furthering fair housing. What does that look like? How can we advocate? We advocate for affordable housing in Northern Virginia, and then that also not being that being fair housing as well, being access to opportunities in a meaningful way. And then the last thing I just want to share, we've also been, Legal Aid Justice Center has been working on a pretty long-term fair housing case related to fair housing for Latina community members in Northern Virginia, specifically related to legal status requirements. And we've won some pretty favorable court rulings in that case, one being that a policy based on legal status can be prohibited under the Fair Housing Act if it disparately impacts a particular group of people based on their race or national origin. And then also recently we just received another favorable ruling in the case, which says that, and I'm going to slow down because it's hard to communicate these legal rulings in a way that is sort of like digestible, but it also holds that basically that a landlord does not actually have a risk under federal anti-harboring law. So there's a federal law that says that landlords that individuals cannot harbor undocumented folks, and that renting is not a risk under that law. So renting to undocumented individuals does not pose any risk to a landlord under the federal anti-harboring law. We just received that court ruling in January. And so we've been working on cases that will further the rights of immigrant communities to be free from discrimination as well. And that's one example.
Thank you so much for clarifying that point and that issue. Thank you. All right, next question. Are there any suggestions that any of you can think of on how we can work together collaboratively to bring about greater change in the region here of Northern Virginia as it relates to fair housing issues? Anyone?
Would you like to go first?
Okay, then. I would say that we would definitely continue to partner with others in the community to promote fair housing, as evidenced by the collaboration with the Eagle Rights Center and the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors and the others on the panel in terms of promoting fair housing. Increased collaboration with local communities and organizations on programs to affirmatively promote and further fair housing. For example, programs that educate the community and housing providers of their rights and their responsibilities under the Fair Housing Act. Because as talked about today, and many times people do not understand or know what their rights are in the community. And we need to get this information out. So as far as the Human Rights Commission is concerned and the Office of OREP, people will know that if someone discriminates against you based on the protective classes that I mentioned, that you have a right to file a complaint with us, and so that complaint can be investigated. We also need to educate employers and businesses on what the protected rights are under the Act and what their responsibilities are. And so by getting this information out, more of our residents and community would know what their rights are and what they can do, because in terms of the Office of Human Rights and Equity and the Human Rights Commission, there is no fee or charge for you filing a complaint, because this is a matter that is investigated. So in terms of wondering about whether I have to pay a cost or whatever, you don't have to do that because it's free. And if the office cannot handle this, then this is a matter that they collaborate with other offices to work with. So I would, again, say in terms of collaborating with each other is very important, and getting the information out to the community, as we're hopefully doing today.
And if I could piggyback for just one moment, and I'll let the rest of you respond, just to piggyback on what Ms. Crawford is saying. I think it's also important, particularly for housing providers, to understand and know not only what their expectations are under the federal as well as the local fair housing ordinance, but to help them understand certain rights that they have. They have rights too. And so a lot of times after our office will get a complaint and we contact the housing provider, we get this knee-jerk reaction because they're feeling that they're on the end of an investigation and we're coming to get them. We want housing providers to know that we're here to serve them the same way that we're here to serve any individual resident or person who files a complaint. We're here to help them. So we encourage them to contact our office for training. Again, as Ms. Crawford, it's no cost to anybody. We come out and provide these trainings free of charge. So you contact us, we will make arrangements to accommodate you the best way we can to provide you and your staff, your team, with the training that you need so that y'all will understand not only what the Act requires, but how it will help you to be a better housing provider to provide the services. Because we appreciate the fact that you're providing housing for the residents here in Fairfax County. So we're not against you. We want to help you. So I just wanted to add that in terms of what you said about the education piece. So again, some of the rest of you, if you can share with us what you think are some great suggestions on how we can collaborate and work together.
Sure. So one thing I wanted to uplift, we had a great speaker earlier, Sara Pratt, talking about AFFH, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And I want to give a huge shout out to Fairfax County because in 2018, even though the Trump administration suspended the AFFH rule, Fairfax County and other local jurisdictions in Northern Virginia, the district in Maryland, voluntarily started a process of creating a regional fair housing plan. And so they have been working up until literally 2023, when the plan was finally published in its final form, to identify what are the fair housing barriers, both in, for instance, Fairfax County specifically, but also our larger region, because we know that these barriers don't stop at a county's borders. And so this plan required a lot of thought. They had a community engagement process. I will admit the plan is a bit long, so if you're not looking to read hundreds of pages, I completely understand. But there is an executive summary, and there is a section specific to what the inequities are in Fairfax County specifically, not only in housing, but in transportation, education, accessibility for people with disabilities, and so it has a lot of really great information. And through the plan, the region as a whole, and Fairfax County individually as well, identified goals that they have to address barriers to fair housing that still exist in our region. Now we're at the stage where this plan needs to be implemented, and this really speaks to what we as a community, government partners, nonprofit organizations, and other grassroots community partners can do, which is pushing for this plan to be fully implemented. Because what we don't want to have happen is that this plan sits on, the shelf for the next 5 years, and then we say, oh wait, what's happening now, right? So I would encourage everyone to get involved, to check out what the plan says. It's available on the website for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. But specifically, there's a lot of focus, for instance, on affordable housing. And as Sara Pratt referenced earlier, not just affordable housing as this large monolith, but affordable housing at all levels, right? Because we know that affordable housing, the question is, who is it affordable to? And so making sure that we have it throughout the region and available at all these area median income levels, and that we are also proactively working to identify systemic barriers and address those before individuals actually encounter that discrimination. So I would really encourage everyone to be supporting this process and make sure that the Fairfax County and other local jurisdictions can fully implement this so that we can actually work to address these barriers.
Anyone else?
I'll just add something brief, which is that I really agree with I would love to be, we would love to be in conversation with folks about affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think it's a really rich conversation, and I think that in talking more about what that looks like, we can really have creative policies and also considering some of the limits in Virginia related to like what local governments are empowered to do or not, I think is a really interesting conversation, and it can be something that we can, considering local and state level policy change in some of those areas, I think is important. And I would also just highlight more, this is more on like an individual, something that comes up a lot in our work with the communities we support, is that I think expanding awareness of like what fair housing rights are. A lot of, for me, and I've encountered a lot of immigrant community members who don't know that Virginia and federal law apply to them just as much as they apply to me or to any one of us, that there's no distinction based on citizenship or status. And so I think that's a really important piece to always be reminding folks, is like there are resources, you do have fair housing rights, and we can, and kind of bringing people into the conversation is helpful.
Very good, very good.
I don't know.
All right, the next question, and I think this will be our last one based upon time that we have available. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but anyway, are there any actions or suggestions that you can share with the general public here, our audience, that they can take away that will help them create change and develop inclusive neighborhoods and communities free from housing discrimination? Any takeaways that you could suggest for them?
Sure, I'll start with that. So I think that this will involve long-term strategic planning, and that's something that we've all been talking about here all day today, right? No one can do this alone. So the key is partnerships. It starts, with individuals and families, and then local businesses and agencies, and then all three levels of government. So, and also an important part of this is education, is where it starts as well, right? Because the quicker and the more that individuals themselves can start to identify where discrimination is happening, not just blatant discrimination, but things that are happening in that, and then basically the quicker that they can assess the supply and understand the importance of why inclusive housing is there, how it benefits the whole community, not just certain individuals, I think the better the results are going to be. So, I think it's also important for individuals and businesses to review the current policies, right? What's the legislation? What are the regulations? What are the programs that are in place and the policies that affect, affordable housing development? in the target area and then use that data to explore innovations, right? What's worked for developers or investors in the past? What have they overcome successfully? Use those tips to begin conversations with other groups in the community and then see, what you can do together to bring about the change.
Yes, ma'am.
Also, commenting in terms of what you just said, I think, again, it's also important to have community leaders and others remain, the eyes of a neighborhood. And I think it's good in terms of attending events like this, where we are requesting organizations and county agencies to come out and engage in fair housing issues, to share fair housing information with the community would be very helpful. Because in terms of getting information, this would also allow the commission and OREP and agencies in the county also to engage in furthering fair housing, to be able to identify housing issues that exist, housing issues that might be emerging as areas of concern for residents. And this would provide valuable information for outreach efforts, and that way, in terms of knowing what areas we need to target, where to go, what the issues are that we need to raise with our county agencies would be very helpful. And so again, I think it's very important for the community, and like you attending here today, you'll be able to take back information, I hope, from this event and share it with your community, and then be able to raise issues with the county agencies about housing matters that are taking place in your community that you think need to be addressed, or having someone to come out and talk to you. Invite us out. We'll be willing to come out and speak to a group about housing matters of what we, under law, provide. So again, I think, communicating and participation with the community is very important in terms of making sure we further the fair housing in the community. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the history of our neighborhoods and how discrimination took root and shaped our communities. So I think just constantly educating and learning. I wanted to recommend a couple of books that I think do a really good deep dive for folks who are interested in housing policy, and fair housing issues. There's The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And then a very detailed study called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And I think, again, understanding those issues and how those two things really are connected, fair housing and eviction. And I think that eviction or discrimination has changed with time. It used to be much more overt and blatant, and now it can be more subtle and nuanced. And so I think really understanding it and what do you look for? What are some of the red flags? Nowadays you won't really see a landlord put an ad that says no families allowed, because that's blatantly discriminatory and unlawful. But are they doing other things that maybe impact families with children in some way that amounts to discriminatory conduct? So I think understanding the historical context of where we came from and where we are now is something I would recommend for the general public.
Oh, that's very good, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, just to add a little to what Sabrina was saying, I think the system as it's set up now has created these inequities over much time, as we've all been discussing, and I think transforming it will require change on every level. And so I think we all have a part to play in that, and I think that's important in terms of how we show up in our local government conversations, how we show up in our workplace, the work that we're all doing to further fair housing. But I think it's really to me, it really comes back to the idea of participating in the process to create a new system, and we can all do that on some level.
All right, thank you so much. So please Look, wasn't this excellent? I'm telling you, didn't they give us some great information here? Give them a big round of applause. So we really could probably spend the second half of the day going through these things, but unfortunately, we're going to have to bring the meeting to a close. Some of you I know may be a little hungry now and want to go out and take advantage of the lunch that we have provided. So please, again, we want to thank each and every one of you for coming out today and sharing your time and taking part in this information sharing program. And so I hope you got something out of it. Again, if you have any questions or issues related to fair housing, please give our office a call at OREP, and you can call us at area code 703-324-2953. Again, thank you so much. Have a great day. Happy Fair Housing Month.